You didn't just stay quiet. You stayed careful. You learned to sense when it wasn't a good time to speak, when your presence might feel like too much, when asking for something could shift the mood in a way that didn't feel safe. So you waited. You watched faces. You listened to tone. You learned how to read the room before you ever read your own needs. This video is about you if, as a child, you learned not to disturb the people around you. Not because you didn't have things to say, not because you didn't need anything, but because it felt easier to disappear than to risk being a problem. You became aware of yourself in a very specific way. You noticed how your voice landed, how your questions interrupted, how your emotions took up space. And slowly, without anyone directly telling you, you learned to pull back. You waited for the right moment. You waited until things felt calm. You waited until others seemed okay. And most of the time, that moment never came. So you adapted. You kept your needs small. You kept your feelings quiet. You learned how to exist without leaving a mark. You weren't trying to be invisible. You were trying to be acceptable. You learned that being low impact was safer than being fully present. That not disturbing others meant staying connected. That silence protected you from rejection, irritation, or withdrawal. Some children express themselves loudly when something feels wrong. You learned to hold it in. You learned to notice tension before it was spoken, to step back before anyone asked, to sense when your presence might add weight to the room. And over time, this didn't feel like something you were doing. It felt like who you were. You became the child who didn't interrupt, who didn't demand, who didn't need much. And even now, that pattern may still feel familiar, not as a memory, but as a way of being. This pattern doesn't begin because a child wants to be invisible. It begins because a child is paying attention. You weren't born believing that your presence was disruptive. You learned it by noticing how the environment reacted to need, noise, and emotion. Maybe the adults around you were tired, overstimulated, carrying stress that never quite left the room. Not necessarily unkind, not necessarily rejecting, just emotionally full in a way that left little space. And as a child, you felt that fullness. You noticed when voices tightened, when sighs came more often, when irritation lived just beneath the surface. You learned that certain moments weren't safe for expression, that asking questions could feel like interruption, that wanting something could feel like adding pressure. So your body adapted before your mind ever named it. You learned to pause, to check first, to wait. When the room felt heavy, you became lighter. When emotions ran high, you became quieter. When things felt fragile, you learned not to touch. No one had to tell you, "Don't disturb us." The atmosphere taught you. And because you were a child, you took that information seriously. You may have been praised for being well-behaved, for being so considerate, for not making a fuss. Those words sounded kind, but they also carried a message your nervous system absorbed. Your safety depends on not adding anything. So you learned to monitor yourself. You checked your impulses before acting on them. You filtered your words before speaking them. You softened your emotions before showing them. This wasn't politeness. It was protection. A child who learns not to disturb is a child who senses that the environment cannot hold them fully. So they shrink to fit what's available. They learn that connection stays intact when they are quiet, that approval comes when they are easy, that closeness is safest when they don't ask for more. And over time, this adaptation becomes automatic. You stop noticing how often you pause yourself, how often you wait for permission that never comes, how often you disappear just enough to keep things smooth. Because when you learn early that disturbance risks disconnection, staying small starts to feel like love. You might notice that this pattern didn't stay in childhood. Even now, there's often a pause before you speak, a quiet check, an internal scan of the room. Is this a good time? Is this necessary? Will this be too much? You may find yourself holding back questions, even simple ones, waiting for the right opening, letting conversations pass without entering them. Not because you don't have thoughts, but because interrupting still feels risky. You might downplay your needs without realizing you're doing it. You say, "It's fine," quickly. You adjust your preferences. You tell yourself you don't really mind. And often, people experience you as easy to be around. Low maintenance, considerate. But inside, there's a different experience. You're rarely fully settled in shared spaces. Part of you is always monitoring how much space you're taking, how much attention you're drawing, whether your presence is creating friction. You might feel a subtle tension when you want something, an urge to retract it before it's fully formed, a sense that needing more could disturb the balance. So you wait. In relationships, this can look like patience, understanding, flexibility, but it can also mean that your inner world goes unseen, not because others don't care, but because you've learned not to show it. You may feel strangely disconnected even when you're close to people, as if part of you is still standing slightly outside the room, present but not fully inside. And the conflict is this, logically, that expressing yourself isn't wrong. You know that your needs matter. You know that relationships are supposed to hold space for you too. But your body still reacts as if disturbance equals danger. So even when no one is asking you to stay small, you still do. You still hesitate. You still soften. You still step back. And over time, this creates a quiet exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of doing too much, but the exhaustion of constantly editing yourself. Because you're not just living, you're managing your presence. And somewhere beneath that management is a question that rarely gets spoken. What would happen if you didn't disappear so quickly? There is nothing wrong with the way you learn to be careful. You didn't become this way because you lacked confidence. You didn't become this way because you were weak or overly sensitive. You became this way because you were attentive. You learned to read the emotional temperature of a room because it mattered. You learned to pause yourself because it kept connection intact. You learned to stay out of the way because at one time that felt safer than being fully seen. This pattern wasn't a flaw. It was an adaptation. And adaptations don't disappear just because the environment changes. They stay with the body. They stay with the nervous system. So when you still hesitate before speaking, when you still feel the urge to shrink, when you still check yourself before expressing a need, it doesn't mean you're failing to grow. It means your body is loyal to what once protected you. You weren't wrong to learn this, and you don't need to be ashamed of still carrying it. What matters is not forcing yourself to be louder, bolder, or more demanding. This isn't about pushing past your instincts. It's about gently noticing that the world you're in now is not the same one you adapted to. You are no longer a child whose safety depends on staying small. Even if your body hasn't fully learned that yet, there is room for you now, not because you've earned it, not because you're being convenient, but because you exist. And learning that takes time. You were not too much. You were careful in a place that couldn't fully hold you. You learned not to disturb because connection mattered to you. And even now, you are allowed to take up space without disappearing first.